Section 12 of The Wood Beyond the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Corey Samuel. The Wood Beyond the World by William Morris. Chapter 34. Now cometh the maid to the king. Then all they bowed before the king, and he spake again, What is that noise that I hear without, as if it were the rising of the sea on a sandy shore, when the south-west wind is blowing? Then the elder opened his mouth to answer, but before he might get out the word, there was a stir without the chamber door, and the throng parted, and lo, amidst of them came the maid, and she yet clad in nought save the white coat wherewith she had won through the wilderness, save that on her head was a garland of red roses, and her middle was wreathed with the same. Fresh and fair she was, as the dawn of June, her face bright, red-lipped and clear-eyed, and her cheeks flushed with hope and love. She went straight to Walter where he sat, and lightly put away with her hand the elder who would lead her to the ivory throne beside the king. But she knelt down before him, and laid her hand on his steel-clad knee, and said, O my lord, now I see that thou hast beguiled me, and that thou wert all along a king-born man, coming home to thy realm. But so dear thou hast been to me, and so fair and clear, and so kind withal do thine eyes shine on me from under the grey war-helm, that I will beseech thee not to cast me out utterly, but suffer me to be thy servant and handmaid for a while. Wilt thou not? But the king stooped down to her, and raised her up, and stood on his feet, and took her hands and kissed them, and set her down beside him, and said to her, Sweetheart, this is now thy place till the night cometh, even by my side. So she sat down there, meek and valiant, her hands laid in her lap, and her feet one over the other, while the king said, Lords, this is my beloved and my spouse. Now, therefore, if ye will have me for king, ye must worship this one for queen and lady, or else suffer us both to go our ways in peace. Then all they that were in the chamber cried aloud, The queen, the lady, the beloved of our lord. And this cry came from their hearts, and not their lips only. For as they looked on her, and the brightness of her beauty, they saw also the meekness of her demeanour, and the high heart of her, and they all fell to loving her. But the young men of them, their cheeks flushed as they beheld her, and their hearts went out to her, and they drew their swords and brandished them aloft, and cried out for her, as men made suddenly drunk with love, The queen, the lady, the lovely one. Chapter 35. Of the King of Starkwall and his Queen. But while this betid, that murmur without, which is aforesaid, grew louder, and it smote on the king's ear, and he said again to the elder, Tell us now of that noise withoutward, what is it? Said the elder, If thou, king, and the queen, wilt but arise and stand in the window, and go forth into the hanging gallery thereof, then shall ye know at once what is this rumour, and therewithal shall ye see a sight meet to rejoice the heart of a king new come into kingship. So the king arose, and took the maid by the hand, and went to the window and looked forth, and lo, the great square of the place all thronged with folk as thick as they could stand, and the more part of the carles with a weapon in hand, and many armed right gallantly. Then he went out into the gallery with his queen, still holding her hand, and his lords and wise men stood behind him. Straightway then arose a cry, and a shout of joy and welcome that rent the very heavens, and the great place was all glittering and strange with the tossing up of spears and the brandishing of swords, and the stretching forth of hands. But the maid spake softly to King Walter, and said, Here then is the wilderness left behind a long way, and here is warding and protection against the foes of our life and soul. O blessed be thou and thy valiant heart. But Walter spake nothing, but stood as one in a dream, and yet, if that might be, his longing toward her increased manifold. But down below, amidst of the throng, stood two neighbours somewhat anigh to the window, and quoth one to the other, See thou, the new man in the ancient armour of the Battle of the Waters, bearing the sword that slew the foeman king on the day of the doubtful onset. Surely this is a sign of good luck to us all. Yea, said the second, he beareth his armour well, and the eyes are bright in the head of him. But hast thou beheld well his she-fellow, and what the like of her is? I see her, said the other, that she is a fair woman, yet somewhat worse clad than simply. She is in her smock, man, and were it not for the balusters, I deem ye should see her barefoot. What is amiss with her? Dost thou not see her? Said the second neighbour, that she is not only a fair woman, but yet more, one of those lovely ones that draw the heart out of a man's body, one may scarce say for why. Surely stark wall hath cast a lucky net this time. And as to her raiment, I see of her that she is clad in white, and wreathed with roses, but that the flesh of her is so wholly pure and sweet, that it maketh all her attire but a part of her body, and halloweth it, so that it hath the semblance of gems. Alas, my friend, let us hope that this queen will fare abroad unseldom amongst the people. Thus then they spake. But after a while the king and his mates went back into the chamber, and he gave command that the women of the queen should come and fetch her away, to attire her in royal array. And thither came the fairest of the honourable damsels, and were fain of being her waiting women. Therewithal the king was unarmed, and dight most gloriously, but still he bore the sword of the king's slaying. And sithence were the king and the queen brought into the great hall of the palace, and they met on a dais, and kissed before the lords and other folk that thronged the hall. There they ate a morsel, and drank a cup together, while all beheld them. And then they were brought forth, and a white horse of the goodliest, well bedight, brought for each of them. And thereon they mounted, and went their ways together, by the lane which the huge throng made for them, to the great church, for the hallowing and the crowning. And they were led by one squire alone, and he unarmed, for such was the custom of Starkwall when a new king should be hallowed. So came they to the great church, for that folk was not miscreant, so to say. And they entered it, they two alone, and went into the choir. And when they had stood there a little while, wondering at their lot, they heard how the bells fell a ringing tunefully over their heads, and then drew near the sound of many trumpets blowing together, and thereafter the voices of many folk singing. And then were the great doors thrown open, and the bishop and his priests came into the church with singing and minstrelsy. And thereafter came the whole throng of the folk, and presently the nave of the church was filled by it, as when the water follows the cutting of the dam and fills up the dyke. Thereafter came the bishop and his mates into the choir, and came up to the king, and gave him and the queen the kiss of peace. This was mass sung gloriously, and thereafter was the king anointed and crowned, and great joy made throughout the church. Afterwards they went back afoot to the palace, they two alone together, with none but the esquire going before to show them the way. And as they went, they passed close beside those two neighbours, whose talk has been told of afore. And the first one, he who had praised the king's war array, spake and said: Truly, neighbour, thou art in the right of it, and now the queen has been dight duly, and hath a crown on her head, and is clad in white samite done all over with pearls. I see her to be of exceeding goodliness, as goodly may be as the Lord King. Quoth the other: Unto me she seemeth as she did e'en now,